you're a savior, right?
Somebody asked me to do this.
No, that's fine. But it's not Acts. And see, that's where Protestants always have trouble with the book of James, because James seems to emphasize good works. And for lack of a better term, Orthodox Protestants, that drives them nuts. Because no, it's justification by faith alone, and it's you're making a personal commitment that Jesus is your Savior, right?
But it's also true. That's just one model of salvation in Christianity. I heard it called the forensic model. That humanity fucked up so bad that God had to kill his own son to pay our debt of fuck-uppedness. And there are other models of what what the whole Jesus thing was about. And so like in the Orthodox, at least the Orthodox people that I was familiar with, the central feature of the life of Christ was not the crucifixion and resurrection, it was the transfiguration. And the idea was that that God manifested in human flesh in order that human flesh could become divinized. And the idea is that we are now, it's not like we become God, but the whole purpose of the incarnation was to provide a path for the redivinization of humanity and for our unification with the divine, and creating not merely a transactional relationship, but actually a transformation of the human being into a new kind of being. And so, there are other models in Christianity as to what the incarnation was about and who Jesus was and how all that works. The forensic model that is the most popular in at least Protestant theology and probably Roman Catholic. So, anyway.
So I like that.
So should we talk? What's that?
That was a good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
So I like that that emphasis on the transfiguration. That I think that's very interesting. And so I think one way to kind of segue into Borges is so a lot of Christianity, there's like this relationship with a creator and what is created, and it's based off that relation that it seems like a lot of Christian theology it kind of comes out of, based off the assumptions that they bring into how that relation exactly works. And I think part of what this the first story, The Circular Ruins, is talking about is basically that relation of what exactly the things we create, what exactly is our relation to them? Do they in some way create us as well? Is this actually a kind of reciprocal creation? And you can't really say that there's a kind of one-way idea of, correspondence where there's just simply a creator and then the created. Perhaps there can only be a creator that's also in this process of being created itself by being something that creates. And in the same way, the things that are created also bring forth what this creation is, which is a creating thing. So that probably sounded confusing, but I think it's basically that, imagine that life itself, in a way, the fire, the vital spark of life is creation. Then you'd have to have creation basically refracted on all levels. And I think that's something kind of like what's going on here with this idea of, basically it's like the whole M. Night Shyamalan twist at the end where, oh my God, he's dreaming also, the magician who created his essentially through this act of dreaming creation is himself also reciprocally a dreamed up creation. So I think that's possibly one way to kind of segue into this.
So one question I have is why did the first effort fail? When he doesn't say a lot about it. Anyway, thoughts?
So I think one way to think of it is that, so one thing I thought that was really interesting with the story. So I've read it 3 times now. The first time, I don't think I really got much of it at all, except the very end. I was like, oh, that's clever. And then when I read it the second time, knowing how it ends, a lot more has opened up to me, where I began to see that there's a lot of ambiguous language where he seems to be, you're not sure if it's the kind of the creation talking about the creator or the creator talking about the creation. And that was pretty interesting. And then the third time I read it was from a very kind of hermetic, magical point of view, where, so I've studied tarot and do tarot readings, and in that you have to learn all about correspondences and the elements, the 4 directions, and how there's this whole system of correspondences. So I did it from that perspective, because I know Borges was knowledgeable about that stuff, and I found that this whole idea of the circular ruins, basically, in this kind of what would I call it? Kind of ancient hermetic understandings. Everything is kind of circles within circles in this system of correspondences, and he's kind of going through all these different phases that are kind of like, you can almost see it as I think Jung was a kind of modern hermetic in this sense, that he was trying to kind of bring forth this kind of these balances into an individuated whole. And I think that's kind of also the creative process that's going on here, which you can see that as the kind of either a magical act or an artistic act, or in this case, I think it's a kind of metafictional, artistic, magical act that Borges is doing, and that he's kind of commenting on his own creation of the story as an artistic process. So to actually answer your question, though, I think kind of he goes through these different phases of basically, you can think of it as a kind of 4-fold emphasis in terms of the different elements, which correspond to different elements of, say, a personality and whatnot. So it'd be like fire is like creativity and intuition and the vital force of life and whatnot, which is very significant in this story. And then you've got the West, which is, that's the falling sun, that is emotions, that's basically the flow of life and whatnot. Then you have Earth, which is the material aspect, that's midnight. And then you have the East, which is the rising sun, that's the dawn, that's the air that corresponds with the intellect, with intelligence, with ideas and things like that. I think he has to go through all these things and bring all of them into a kind of convergence, which is similar to the same thing as the artistic process itself, where in a metaphorical aspect, of course, you have to kind of go through, give what you create a kind of, first, there has to be some kind of an intelligence to it, a kind of idea, yet that is animated with some kind of life, that has some kind of feeling to it, and has some kind of body or material aspect to it. And they have to converge with each other. And I think at first when it doesn't work out, it's because there's a kind of lack of conjunction of those things. So that's at least one way to answer that.
When you brought up the 4, I hadn't seen it before, Chase. But remember in ancient Greece, they thought that there are only 4 elements, right? Fire, water, earth, and air. And so looking at it that way, even though Borges doesn't mention, I don't think ever explicitly, the ancient Greeks, he mentions the Gnostics. But when you talk about the 4-fold elements of personality, and then talking about fire, water, earth, and air, those were the elements for the Greeks, and they also connected it to human health, right? The Greek humoral system, where our bodies had humors, and that, black bile, yellow bile, and that it was when we had a disease, it was because those humors were out of balance. So it seems, and Nevitt mentioned the word magician, which I had forgotten, but Borges literally uses the word magician later in the short story to describe the creator. So there is this sense of, well, I don't want to say alchemy, but this creativity with material elements, but hearkening back to much older traditions.
I don't know, if this is related to what Chase was talking about, because of the intellect makes me wonder, but I just noticed on page 46 in this edition, I don't know where it is in the other one, when he's first starting to dream up the first guy, and he's got these clouds of students, and so he's lecturing to them, and he says, the man was lecturing on anatomy, cosmography, magic, and the countenances listened with eagerness and strove to respond with understanding. So it seems to be all about, and then he's looking for someone who would be worthy to be interpolated into reality. It seems to merit participation in the universe. So it seems like it's very intellectual. It's a college, he says, and so he's trying to impart knowledge to these beings, and that's all there is to it. Whereas in the second case, he begins with the body and then builds up the body organ by organ. So I don't know exactly what that means, but seems to be a pretty big difference. You're just sitting there lecturing to these people and trying to stuff information into them, and somehow that's supposed to give them the power to incarnate. Whereas in the second case, he also says he dreamt him asleep. And so he's not teaching him, he's asleep, and he's just building his body up organ by organ. I don't know what that means, but that's a pretty big difference.
So one part that I found interesting about that section where he first has this kind of this classroom of these students, and he's trying to pick out one exemplary student, in a sense, that stands, ready or worthy of being interpolated into existence. So I think Hunter at least will like this, because I saw a lot of Hegel in this. Oh, Hunter's gone. Oh, well.
He's in the restroom.
Okay. So I think he talks about basically the necessity that these, the importance, so he's teaching this class, and he says basically they listened with eagerness and strove to respond with understanding, as if they divined the importance of the examination, which would redeem one of them from his state of vain appearance and interpolate him into the world of reality. And he talks about how they so basically he wants something that actually has a little pushback, a reasonable contradiction, instead of just a passive acceptance of things. So I'm reminded of, the master-slave dialectic, and the whole idea of kind of coming to a mutual recognition of these things, that it has to work. And even says in here, at the beginning of that paragraph before, he says, at first his dreams were chaotic, somewhat later they were of a dialectical nature. So I see that as very important, in the sense that they're talking about a kind of mutual recognition, a process of mutual recognition between what is creating and what is created. And also I see in that the dialectical nature also of that is that the magician who thinks he's the sole creator, who, at the very beginning, he comes out of nowhere, he's forgotten his past and whatnot, and he talks about this basically this process of creation, though he could easily be kind of drawn into the same in a kind of ambiguous way, where they're talking about him as well. So I think the dialectical nature, you can read almost in every line here, that basically they're talking about him also. And I see that when he's awake, he's the whether it's his creation or some other, or there's like an infinite regress of creators, you could see that as kind of like that's them dreaming and building up his own creation in a way. So I like to see that dialectical nature of that, but also this idea of that there's a kind of, Hegelian dialectical recognition going on here between these different levels of creation and whatnot.
So it is interesting to me, like, I definitely, it seems to me like you're kind of implying this from some of the things you're saying, Chase, but the word that really stuck out to me was iterativity. And I actually, I don't remember exactly when I guessed it, but I kind of guessed the ending. I'd never read this before, pretty early on. And it just seemed to me it was because there was a lot of parallels lining up between the job that he was going to present before his creation and then the way that we started off in the story. The fact that there was this, like, okay, we know there's a bunch of different temples. We know that he's sending his person to go to that temple to do some sort of magical project. It's going to involve, relating to the god of that temple. So I like, my brain just connected together really fast, for whatever weird reason. And it struck me that this iterative process, is very interesting to think about in terms of attempting to do a writing project or something like that. Like I've encountered that a lot whenever I've like gone back and tried to work on a similar philosophical project again, and I write a new paper on it or something like that, where the old paper is sort of informing the paper that I'm writing now, and it's kind of like bringing out certain aspects of it, but simultaneously it's different, and it can kind of constitute its own sort of entity, if that makes sense. And so, I mean, we can talk about dialectics, but one thing about that process that dialectics doesn't really capture very well is that writing the new paper doesn't change the old paper. The old paper still exists. It might change how I relate to it, but it's still gonna have the same words, right? And it's still gonna have the same sort of content to it. And I thought that was an interesting aspect, because it doesn't really feel like we see that much change in the character of the magician who we're actually paying attention to in the context of the story. So it doesn't seem to me that there's a dialectic going on there. Part of why I think that's important is because what he mentioned specifically looking for in the failed project, right? The one where he has like the school of students and he's sort of picking out between them, is he's specifically looking for a student who disagrees, right? Who's willing to sort of come up again, and say, no, you're wrong about this, and this, and this. I thought that was an interesting sort of recognition, because there is this point where, I mean, I think I also thought a lot about just children and parents and their relationships with, to each other. I mean, I think a lot about my relationship with my parents. I had a pretty good one. I know a lot of other people don't, but it is very interesting because, like, one thing I'm terrified of is being trapped in their worst characteristics. So the things that I don't really enjoy about them, or even some of them are things that I enjoy about them, but I just don't think are good, if that makes sense. So I'm just sort of like, okay, well, I kind of like that about my dad. I don't want to be like that, so I want to figure out something else that I can sort of do. So there's this sort of iterative aspect, it seems to me, in the process of developing something. And I think too, with this might shed a little bit of light on, so why does the first process sort of fail and then the second process succeed? I mean, if we're thinking about that in terms of a question of embodiment, right? I think, the interesting thing is that I think if we just intellectually designed our children, this is maybe getting a little bit into like, some sort of transhumanism type stuff. Like if we could start genetically determining what our children were going to be like, I worry about that a lot of the time, because I mean, even though it sucks that children inherit, unfortunate aspects of the genetics of their parents, like, genetic diseases and stuff like that. It does seem to me that if I have authorial control over like that that process, then it might become too intellectualized. And there's something about like the raw viscerality of like, okay, here is a heart and here is a skeleton, and this process of construction that really, I think, distinguishes it from like the intellectual construction of a human being, if that makes sense.
So
I
could definitely.
I just want to just interject one quick comment. In addition to the physicality, there seems to be, in the second case, more affection, and rather than just a purely thing, he has this affection of like a father. Go ahead, Chase.
Yeah, so I basically just realized that. So I always thought of it like the first failed attempt was just kind of like a hiatus, but it was still kind of a continuation of the first kind of student that he picked out. And I'm starting to realize it's probably actually kind of like he almost had to start over, which I didn't realize until basically just now. And then that really kind of brings to mind, why did that fail? And I think, Sean, that's a really, really good observation to kind of make that connection. I think that's really interesting. This kind of, if our creation is too intellectualized and too kind of complete and idealistic and manipulated by us, rather than kind of being worked through a kind of, really, I think it's kind of like, okay, so Socrates, he said basically, philosophy is a kind of midwifery, where you're helping something along. You're not exactly creating it, out of ex nihilo. So I think you could see it kind of like that, in that he's bringing this creation into being. Before he imagined it, almost like fully formed as a very intellectual thing, as an idea. And there's actually at the beginning of this, so I pay attention to kind of the correspondence ideas, because he mentions a lot the time of the day that he's sleeping. And all of those times at the very beginning correspond to the east, and to which is the element of air, which is the element of intellect. So I think it's almost like he was trying to create something wholly of intellect, and that's probably why it failed, where the second creation that actually works is something where he goes through these whole cycles. And I think that's what a lot of this story is about these whole complete cycles to bring things into creation. And so and the whole idea of, like genetic manipulation and things like that a lot of people believe. There's a kind of, it seems like a pretty common theme now in Borges, which I think the Library of Babel gets into this a lot as well. And Talon and that story also did, is this kind of danger of the intellectualized totality of something, of this kind of false completeness of something that kind of takes over from, this real world of kind of chaotic chance and whatnot. So I think more he's kind of, the second creation is a kind of convergence of all these different forces, and there's an element of chance in there, which is basically an affirmation of the creative power of the universe kind of outside of our intellectual understanding. So I think he's working more at those forces that are kind of beyond his own mere intellect in a very limited sense to work with that. So one more thing is basically, so you were able to figure it out before the end. I was not when I first read the story, but since rereading it, I noticed all these kind of, self-recursive statements he's making. One towards the very end, beginning of the last paragraph, I thought was kind of funny. He says, basically, it's when, fire is circled around in this burnt ruins, and he realized basically this is all like cycles that are this like eternal return and whatnot. He says, the end of his meditations was sudden, though it was foretold in certain signs. That's a kind of hint I see it to basically how he had hinted through the whole story what was, happening at the end by even the name of it, the circular ruins. It's very interesting how that works, and I see it as kind of like there's a kind of, so fire is an interesting element that one thing it represents the creative aspect of the universe, but also the destructive aspect, and that it's kind of these burnt ruins is that kind of destructive aspect, as well as the fact that fire is itself is consumptive, but also there's this creative aspect to it as well. So I think that's interesting in seeing these ideas like these cycles and whatnot. So I'll go ahead and stop there.
You're commenting on I'm going to respond to multiple things because you said multiple things. But when you talked about fire, if you think about it, especially more ancient peoples, fire was an essential element of purification, right? I mean, the Romans didn't bear, my understanding is Romans didn't bear, I mean, they actually had a funeral pyre, and the Vikings also would do that, put people on a person on a small boat and light it and send it off to, I guess, Valhalla. And so to me, Borges' referencing of fire, and remember, there is a certain sacred tone, it seems to me, in this story. Borges, I didn't see any kind of ridicule in the magician and what he was trying to do. It wasn't like Borges was God saying, haha, you're an idiot, you didn't know you were a dream. I mean, he takes what this man is doing very seriously. And so, and you mentioned, Chase, the end of his meditations were sudden, but was foretold. Going to the literal very beginning of the short story, he has this quotation from Through the Looking Glass. And if he let off dreaming about you, right? And so here you have a dream connected to a person. And then you and I mentioned this, I think, the first time we started to talk about Borges, but Borges will use words in some ways in their literal original meaning. So in the first sentence, he says, no one saw him disembark in the unanimous night. And unanimous could be literally read as of one mind. So again, this totality of thought of the dream. But I thought that, and I appreciated Joey and Nevitt writing in the chat, about the creative act can't simply be an intellectual one. That there does seem to be something that a person has to be really, really interested in what they're studying to be creative in it. How many people come up with a creation that are frankly bored by what they're doing, right? I mean, there's a certain excitement. Now, I get bored stiff thinking about a bunch of rocks in geology, but other people are like, oh my God, look at this rock I found. I'm like, yeah, you found a rock. Great. Okay, fine. That person's gonna make a geological discovery of some type, no matter how minor. And, I think, and you had mentioned this, I think, about the parallels, or I think actually it was Sean. Creativity, intellectualism, emotion. And so I saw this short story I've read many, many times, and I really appreciate all of your comments, because for some reason, this is a story that to me is very troubling. It's just disconcerting. To me, it's very subversive and radical in the literal meaning of the word radical, going to the roots of things. And how does one prove that they're not dreaming? How does one prove that what they're experiencing is reality?
Since the first session, I keep wondering whenever I read one of these, to what degree is he just describing our reality in different terms? And and he may not be at all in some of these, but I was thinking of the human world, the world in which we live. I tend to think of the next story, the Library of Babel, in a similar way, but the world, like Nietzsche says, everything is interpretation. Rilke talks about, we being in this interpreted world, animals not really being comfortable in our interpreted world, and that the world we live in is a world of human interpretation, and that is in some sense recursive, that we create the world for the next generation and so on. So anyway, it's not a very well formed idea, but when you say, like, is this a world a dream or not? I mean, you could say it in the sense that it's a human created world. It's a fully interpreted world, that it is a dream world, and that we really have no way of getting at the undreamed world, that we live only in the dream world of this human world interpreted by symbols and meanings and values and so on. So, maybe I'm way off on this, but that's what I'm wondering if that's maybe one way to look at the story is there's this, as Sean said, this sort of iterative process of reconstructing the dream over and over and over and over.
One thing that I think is interesting to that, because one thing the story does that's different from like a classical, like Cartesian evil demon experiment type thing, is it reverses who is the dream and what reality is, right? Because I mean, it could be that the entirety of the reality in this story is a dream. We aren't told anything about that, but it's at least implied that it must have a different category of reality to it by the end, at least on the basis that the fire didn't burn the magician, right? Like this is how we know that he's dreamed. So certainly, like, there at least have to be two different categories of entities, right? There's this world that appears to have some kind of physicality to it, and then there are these dream characters. And I think what's interesting to that, to me, right, if we slot it into this question of like imagined realities, is it definitely seems to imply what I think something like phenomenology implies, that there is a there in terms of our experiences with it, of our phenomenological perceptions encounter a reality, but it doesn't mean that what we are and how we interact with those perceptions can't be shaped in all sorts of ways, all sorts of illusory ways that I think you can nihilistically sort of just dismiss as, well, isn't this all just fakery and perception? Although I'm definitely like, I think at this point, I've kind of been inculcated with Nietzsche and phenomenology enough at this point that I guess it just doesn't bother me very much, this question of whether or not what I'm experiencing right now is a dream or if it's the real reality. Like I'm kind of just like, oh, if it's a dream, it's an interesting one, so I'll stick with it,
Something you said, Sean, just really hit me. We're all accepting that the narrator of the story is dreamt. Who's the dreamer?
Obviously it's God, right? We've
that your reaction surprised me because you were just talking about Nietzsche. I was like, wait a second, I thought you said God was dead. So okay, come on, what's your plan B? Who else is? Oh, is that where I put it? Yeah. So I don't know. Nietzsche's got to have a plan B, right? I mean, it can't be God. So who is it? Is it us? Are we helping to dream them because we're actually reading the story?
I had this, and this is like totally superfluous, totally unnecessary, input. I recognize that. However, I found a parallel between Borges here in this story in Circular Ruins, between this story and then the next story, the Library of Babel, and then and then the reading that we just recently did for Bergson, where Bergson was describing life in the vital force in this very particular way that I feel like Borges is creating parallels to. I don't know how much Borges cared about Bergson or read Bergson particularly, but either way, my point being, I think I have I had a notion, and I currently still have a notion of what the dreamer, the magician, where he came from, I guess, and what he means when he says, or what I thought he meant when he said, I am also the dream of a man, and so I can walk into the fire and be engulfed and not burned. You know what I mean? I think that the question is that we're asking might be a little, misdirected. I think it's not who is dreaming the man. It's what do we mean? What are we talking about when we say him or the man or the magician? Are we talking about his physical corporeal body that's getting eaten by fire? Or are we talking about the notion of his individualized vital force as a consciousness, as an experience, as a sovereign individual among the humanist project, or as a subject of God, on the pre-enlightenment project? And I think that the whole walking into the fire and not being burned because he recognizes that he's the dream of another is sort of this, and the way I immediately read it, and this is just because of my personal experience, was that, like, it's the same reason that Borges says that life does not end. He says that life is the force that uses living beings as a medium. It enters into your parents, and then your parents come together and create a bud of you, and it's the same life force that's trickling down through these layers, through this garden of forking paths of lineage. And at no point is there sort of a unified idealist sort of like self. There's not like a central individual sovereign, being, this psychic island, and I think maybe Borges is questioning the notion of the individual, the sovereign individual of the island, and saying, I can die, right? I can be engulfed in this flame, because the notion of me, when I say the word hunter or me or the magician or the creator, all of this personality, all of this being is manifested because of the dreams of others, because of a society that tells me that I need to do what's what, and I need to dress a certain way, I need to live a certain way, I need to think certain things. You know what I mean? I build a personality out of my sort of empty being. What do you have to say, Ben? I'm curious.
Begging your pardon, I'm giving you too many nonverbal cues. It just hit me when you were talking. Look at the number of times in the story the magician is referred to as he. He did this, he did that, he did this, he did that. No one saw him disembark. I still love that sentence. No one saw him disembark in the unanimous night. No one saw the bamboo canoe sinking into the sacred mud. But I think I found one place. It's the only place where there's an I, and it's in the paragraph that's towards the end of the story that starts out, the magician carried out these orders. He devoted a period of time, which finally comprised 2 years. Did you find that? To revealing the arcana, is it arcana of the universe and of the fire cult to his dream child? At the very end of that paragraph, it's italicized in my version. And it says, now I shall be with my son. Or less often, the child I have engendered awaits me, and I will not exist if I do not go to him. And to me, that when you were talking, Hunter, it just jumped out at me that, the personality, how are we as people? We talk about individuality, but aren't we a really odd mixture of DNA and outer environment? But the only time there's the I is when he's referencing himself in relation to his son. And then it's I. And I would love to hear anybody's sense of that.
I kind of have a question to follow up on that. Kind of earlier in that paragraph before it, once it says, one afternoon the man almost destroyed his work, but then repented. It would have been better for him had he destroyed it. I guess, what do you think that implication is, especially reading that and then a little bit further down, now I shall be with my son. And so what do you think like that implication of destruction means in this context?
I actually have, I mean, it kind of goes with what you guys are saying, but my perspective on this was more about like creation, I guess, and what it means to create something for me. And I feel like, you guys said that the first was a failure. The first imagining of this person was a failure, and then the second one, I think they were both the same. And I think that if he had continued down the path of creating this person in the first path, the same thing would have happened. Because I think that this story is about creating something and then losing your sense of self from that creation, and identifying more with the thing that you've created than yourself. And I think that that's I can't help but constantly see Borges kind of reference him creating things as kind of like a theme throughout all these stories. And I think that when you create something and when you kind of venture this quest to create something new, that in a lot of ways you can identify with it more than you can identify with yourself at some point. You can get lost in that creation. You can lose kind of even the reason why you did it in the first place and become that sort of thing. I don't know, it's not really a fully formed idea necessarily, but I just get this feeling that as the story goes on, he ends up like, if he hadn't started this dream, if he hadn't tried to dream up a person, he never would have saw himself as an apprentice of another magician, but as he's creating this, as he's starting to imagine the possibility that maybe that's what he is, and then it starts coming forward in this way. But yeah, I just feel like that kind of part where he's like, if he had destroyed it, maybe he would have been better off. That kind of gives me the sense that he lost himself, he lost himself in his creation and ended up becoming that which he created, which maybe isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's he created something and he did something, and and then he gave, in a sense, he gave himself meaning by being that thing. I mean, before, if he hadn't been engulfed by fire, he would just be another person who didn't have any meaning, who whatever. So
that's kind of how I was going to respond, of saying, like, why would it necessarily be a bad thing that he kind of got caught up in this creation? But the fact that one line is kind of like, why would it have been a good thing for him to stop? Like, what kind of sense of self did he have outside of this purpose? That's an interesting.
There's a song called, I think it's titled "Making a Hat" by why am I blanking on the person who seems to have written more Broadway musicals in the last 50 years? Stephen Sondheim. And it's Sunday in the Park with George. And it's a George Seurat, am I pronouncing his name right? Pointillism, that classic gigantic painting of people at a park along a river. And it's a very sad song because he's singing about the excitement of creating something that never existed before. But at the same time, he's acknowledging the cost to himself of spending all that time to be able to create this new thing, because he talks about hearing voices, people walking by his studio and looking through a window, and then the voices become softer and softer, right? So he knows there's an outside world out there. He knows that there's people, but he's not engaged with them. He can't be engaged with them because he's making a hat. And at the very end of it, he talks about it. And then there's a very long, relatively long for a short song, instrumental section. and his final statement is where it had never existed before. So even though it ends on the, hey, I created something that never existed before, through the early part of and the middle part of the song is, what's the cost? So if it's not a long song for you to read the lyrics, or if you want to hear someone perform it, but it's to me, it works as poetry, that's been put to music. But when you were all talking that just now, when you're about getting lost in one's creation, that it just reminded me.
Yeah, just one other thing too. I have a friend who lucid dreams a lot, and the idea of lucid dreaming kind of freaks me out. Like, it stresses me out a lot, because I like to have time where I'm not thinking, and to have that to just be able to go to sleep and not know what'll happen, know what dream will come, and not be in control. Like, I feel like that gives me some distance from myself. I'm not constantly in my head. I have these moments where I can be distanced from myself in a real way by giving control to my subconscious or whatever, but yeah. And I feel like that's a similar thing. Like, you can get lost in dreams in the same way you can get lost in a creation.
But to me, this is the first time anybody wrote about the concept of what you just mentioned, lucid dreaming. I don't remember anybody ever suggesting ever that somehow dreams could be piloted, or at least having some kind of rudder put on them by the conscious thought of the person before they dreamt. But the more and more I've read about dreams, if you tell yourself before you fall asleep that you're going to remember your dreams, you don't have to say it out loud. Just say to yourself, I'm going to remember my dreams. That consciousness of you wanting to remember it will help you remember so much more of your dreams than if you don't do that. And to me, this is a remarkable, given Borges's intellectual background, that he had this psychological insight that, well, maybe we can control our dreams to a certain extent.
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of interesting points. One thing I want to touch on is kind of this question about the individual, and also with the creative process and what is the relation of those things, and also in terms of life as a kind of hereditary force and whatnot. So I think when he says basically it would have been better for the person to have ruined their creation or whatnot, I think that's kind of so Bergson, he talks about that there's these two kind of opposed tendencies of life, that there's the individuation and there's the reproductive aspect. I think that's speaking from the perspective of individuation. That would have been better for him, for his individuality, to have not created this thing, because you see there's a constant kind of reciprocal relation where in him bringing forth his creation, his diminution of spirit is equally being lessened, just as the creation gains in this spirit. And I think that goes to the role of the artist, as well as to even the parent or any kind of a creator of some type, that it involves a kind of sacrifice as you become a kind of medium or caretaker for what it is you're creating. So you have to, and I think that's where I think we tend to intellectualize the process of creation too much as something like what we were talking about before, that it's this purely intellectual construct of the author, that is the sovereign individual that intellectually creates these things out of his pure ideas or whatever. And I think it's more so that the author, whatever it is, the creator has to instead have this kind of kenosis, this self-emptying of themselves, to act as a kind of medium for the bringing forth of what is new which is what is created. And I think that's part of the life process itself, and that there's this kind of reciprocal complementary relation with creation and destruction, that something has to be destroyed for something to be created. It's like the symbol of the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. I think it's something like that with not just humans and whatnot, in that, you know, obviously old people dying is kind of bringing space for the new, for children to be born and whatnot. And I think that's a big part of this understanding that he's talking about in terms of cycles and whatnot, that there's constantly these cycles of the new returning, this kind of eternal repetition of novelty in this creative process, because what is created has to be creative, because that's what life is. But this creative process is this kind of paradoxical destruction through its own creation, and you can reverse that in any number of ways. And that's kind of what's going on here, which you know, it corresponds to so many different levels of, you know, the creative act, basically our lives as you know, the life cycle of being a child, you know, growing up, being a parent, old, dying, being born, and also just our cycles of maturity and whatnot. It really speaks to a lot of those. So yeah.
Yeah, I kind of was gonna ask about that because I feel like that's what he's talking about, like maybe the page before the end, when he's just talking about the wizard's victory and peace were dimmed by wariness. It talks about this diminution, the diminutions of his soul is what nurtured his creation. Yeah, it just seemed like he was just like, as if he had been defeated, but yeah, I guess it's just that kind of like sacrifice.
Yeah, like it says, yeah, his life's purpose was complete. The man persisted in a kind of ecstasy. So ecstasy is a very interesting word. You know,
It's interesting
etymologically.
that they put that next to all, oh
Persisted.
yeah, that too.
Yeah.
But I was it's interesting that phrase was placed among all this other stuff, which made it sound like his world had been like sucked dry. Like he says that colorlessness, but then he's still like in this kind of ecstasy. It does like remind me of the way I've heard like my dad, you know, in his like more sentimental episodes, just talking about like how he feels about, you know, us as kids, but he's just like, my life's kind of worthless now. I'm just work. I support y'all. He's like, I just want to see y'all be happy. It's interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, I think so. I love those lines there. Yeah, so his absent son was being nurtured with these diminutions of his soul. His life's purpose was complete. The man persisted in a kind of ecstasy. So ecstasy, etymologically, that means like out of, stacy, that comes from stasis, from the idea of like standing within. So it's etymologically similar to existence, that standing out. So where existence seems to kind of imply a kind of individuation, you know, something stands out from the background. Ecstasy is a kind of standing outside of the self in a way. So it's this kind of self-transcendent notion that has a kind of diminution to it, but is also kind of like an existence. And I remember in Merleau-Ponty, his ideas about subjectivity and time and whatnot, that seemed to be his central insight in a way, is that kind of like by saying that time was subjectivity, he was basically saying that the subject is a kind of transcendence of itself. I think that's kind of what he's saying here. And in terms of the subject kind of, but also in terms of that the subject is what it is by virtue of its creation, because it has, as a created thing, it kind of brings forth also its further creation. And yeah, those notions are very interesting.
It's a little after 3. Should we move to the next one, do you think?
I'm chill with that.
Yeah, I could talk about all these, I think, like all day, but indeed the other ones are very, very rich as well. So yeah.
Indeed.
I didn't. I'm just wondering here in the second one. This is a speculation on the second page of the story. The italics, at least in this edition, when he's talking about the cyclical book as God, he says the library is a sphere whose exact center is any one of its hexagons and whose circumference is inaccessible. That reminds me of Einstein's description of the relativistic universe. I forget how does this go? It's finite yet unbounded, and the center is anywhere because there is no finite bound. So anyway, I'm wondering if there's some of that in the background here, this notion of an infinity that there's a sort of unboundedness to it, and yet there's a finite number of characters and so on.
So I think that saying that God is a circle whose circumference is nowhere and center is everywhere, something like that. I think that was first attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the kind of legendary founder of, Hermetic magical religion. And that's been repeated, I think, by, it was like Pascal or someone like that too.
Yeah, it was Pascal.
Yeah. So I think that's a good place to start in this idea of like, obviously Borges is obsessed with infinity. And also I think what's interesting is this notion of centering and decentering and the kind of paradox of a conjunction of those, so I have a kind of special heretical interpretation of this story that I like, but it has to do also with this notion of like centering and whatnot. But I think just to start off, I think it's interesting to note also that, there's this connection with him and the later kind of post-structuralist, and he seems to have he's usually interpreted as someone who kind of foresaw the kind of turn from modernism into postmodernism, where there's this kind of radical decentering of the subject because of all these different avenues. And I think in one sense you could kind of really see that here, particularly with this story, is that, today with the information revolution, we're basically drowning in information to a degree that is staggering, to the point where the Library of Babel is online. You can go look it up. The Library of Babel, I think, .info, and it's there online. You can search for it and find any book that's written within those parameters. So that's just, it's like almost banal now, this notion of a kind of infinity of information. And, where does that put us as people, as individuals in this place, as this kind of radical decentering? I think it's almost like what he's trying to get to here is the decentering that we have because of infinity is kind of so radical that it actually puts the center square back at us in this kind of paradoxical sense. So I'll see what you guys think of that. But these notions of centering and decentering within infinity, and just how this idea is so prescient of information and the internet and all these things, I think is quite extraordinary.
I thought it was incredibly interesting that once you get to the decentering part, I think it's page 55 of this version of Labyrinths, vindication is capitalized, and about middle of the page, thousands of the greedy abandoned their sweet native hexagons and rushed up the stairways, urged on by the vain intention of finding their vindication. These pilgrims disputed the narrow corridors, proffered dark curses, strangled each other on the divine stairways, flung the deceptive books into the air shafts, met their deaths cast down in a similar fashion by the inhabitants of remote regions. And I think that really kind of speaks to people really clamoring over trying to find, okay, what's the center, what's their one truth of the capital T, what is their God, what is their purpose of their existence. And that it really mimics, I think, especially like looking throughout social history, like how the rise and fall of just like even different religions, different societies, different political ideologies are all fighting to find, this truth of the capital T, as opposed to understanding that, literally everything is possible, but you have to understand that you yourself are the center, and that you can be searching endlessly your entire life and never find that answer. But it's not something that's so nihilistic. It's something that's more referential in giving yourself meaning and how you create meaning with your interactions, as opposed to that search for knowledge, because the knowledge is infinitesimal. The knowledge is something that is unattainable, and you have to make your peace with that, because we are unable to access that. We're unable to access the circumference. It's inconceivable to us because of how we perceive, how we learn, how we develop thought.
Yeah, I think that almost the existence of this like website and like almost proves his point in a sense, right? It's like we now have access to the Library of Babel, but what does that mean? It's like if we got the meaning, we wouldn't know it's the meaning. And that's kind of, I think, the problem of the whole story, is that it's like these people are searching, but it's like I kept thinking in my head, I was like, but if they found it, how would they know? How would they know that that's their vindication, or that's their solution? It's just it's all there. It's all the information is there for us, and we're in like an information age. I mean, we have so much information, but it's impossible to know what's important, or what's the thing we should focus on. And yeah, so
actually, I'm sorry, may I? I think that this point that is being kind of approached by you, Travis, and by like everybody here is kind of made explicit at the very end, on page 58, on the very last page of the. In fact, if it's just the last paragraph where he's talking about, I've just written the word infinite. I've not interpolated this adjective out of rhetorical habit. I say that it is not illogical to think that the world is infinite, and he goes a little bit further down. This is absurd. The idea of it conceivably being limited is absurd. Those who imagine it to be without limit forget that the possible number of books does have such a limit. So it's just these antagonisms between both ideas. I venture to suggest the solution to the ancient problem. The library is unlimited and cyclical, right? And if an eternal traveler were to cross in any direction, he would see the same volumes repeated with the same disorder. And the most interesting part is when he says, which thus repeated would be an order, the order. And I think that's, and maybe this is just my bias, but I feel like it's a Hegelian point, even if accidental. The disorder itself is the order, but I think that it centers around this notion of the centralization and the decentralization that is constantly being, like when he's talking about how, oh, my father died in a hexagon like 3 feet that way, and I was born in a hexagon right over there, and then I looped around, and now I'm going to die in a hexagon right next door to where I was born. And that's crazy. This sort of notion of, oh, maybe I'm right back to where I started, but I think that it's not just this sort of naive, like, oh, all your attempts at knowledge are futile, sort of like you're just going to end up where you started, kind of like reading. I think that it's much more, it's sort of like he's not saying that the idea of the Library of Babel and the project of the Library of Babel is stupid, and that the attempt is this foolish human hubris. He's never saying that. I think it's a love for this concept. He's talking about how maybe we wrote everything, or we can write everything, or maybe we can even put it into a website, but we don't understand everything, and we never will. Even when we write the word infinite, it's usually just out of rhetorical habit. And I think that this goes back to what I was saying earlier, this relative absolute, this position of like at the end of the phenomenology of spirit. This, as of right now, is the perspective of the absolute. Wherever I am within the hexagon, that is the center of the hexagons. Not because everything is relative and so any sort of attempt at differentiation or of real like meanings is just human folly. It's because the way in which we engage with our environment, the way in which we produce symbolic logic and apply it to the world and to experience, it produces this predicament, this logical predicament, where we are both totally free agents, and yet everything that we just did was necessary and had to have happened, but only after it has already happened in this paradoxical way. Weirdly enough, I'm reading Moby Dick, and there's a part in it where the ship is in the middle of something called the Grand Armada, and it's a circle of sperm whales that extends so far across your perspective that it's the entire horizon, every direction, as far as you can see, is just this writhing mass of sperm whales, which is this sort of divinity or this divine force that he's implying, and the whole point of this Grand Armada thing was that they were sailing and continually attempting to escape and changing directions wildly and inciting violence against the whales and striking them, stabbing them, and trying to get them to start a ruckus, start hitting each other or just to break up so they could escape. And everywhere they moved, the whales, the Armada, moved with them and encapsulated their horizon, no matter what horizon they looked at. And this is God. God is that infinite circle. God is the thing beyond appearance. God is the theological. God is the inhuman core of human experience. It's the shit that we put directly outside of appearance. And that's why I think he's very direct about this problem of God and of this predicament that we're in as we are constantly centered yet constantly decentered. And he says that some people approach it in a deconstructive or in a violent way, like with the inquisitors who are going around burning books because they're wrong, or this search for the man of the book. They said, oh, well, we have to deal with this thing beyond appearance. We have to somehow cope with God. And how do we do that? Oh, maybe it's a guy who read a really good book, and we can find him. And maybe that is the, or maybe it's randomness. Maybe we need to hide inside of bathrooms and have blasphemous dice cups that we shake around, or maybe it's the search for the origin of the library and of time itself. All of these projects are attempts at coping with this thing beyond our totality. Even if we are in the present, even if we've written it all down, even if we totalize experience, not only within our books is there something beyond, but there's also this beyond the beyond. You know what I mean? There's this total pressure, this pressure that we feel that spurs our desire to find meaning and to say, well, maybe it's random, or maybe it's a guy with a book. Or, I don't know, maybe it's pointless. Maybe the library isn't real. Maybe there's never a point to finding it. I don't know. I think that's what I got the most out of the story, is this coping, this constant coping with all these different approaches towards this problem that Borges is obsessed with of man's desire, or sort of categorical imperative almost, to rationalize everything and to attempt to understand everything and to try to someday figure out everything, like it's as if he's saying, like, yeah, it's impossible, but we're going to keep doing it because we have to keep doing it. And I don't really know what that means, but if anybody.
Yeah, I like a lot of what you guys are talking about. So, I see that as, where, Ed said that the circular ruins is kind of scary to him, but to me, this one is kind of scary to me, where I'm not really scared of, the idea of, like a skepticism about dreams or anything like that. But this idea of kind of being swallowed in a kind of totality that's preset. I think that's and I think that's where you have parallels with the Toulon story, which actually it references in the second to last page, where he talks about the best volumes of many hexagrams under my administration. Entitled, he has some strange names. And another, I don't know how to say, is Axaxaxas Malo. That's actually a line from the language that the people in Toulon speak, which is about the verbal language or whatnot. So I think that kind of sets it up. But I think ultimately what this is, it's kind of like, okay, this thing is a kind of totality that presents itself as basically it's already done everything that can possibly be done based off these, algorithms just fulfilled. But ultimately, it's kind of a lie, really, because you actually can't put all the languages in just, the Latin alphabet. What about semicolons? What about question marks, exclamation points? Things outside. I think this is almost like, when he's making the comment about that Toulon uses this Anglo-American encyclopedia, that there's this notion of trying to come up with this false idea of totality. So I think that's important here, in that, but then there's still kind of like, okay, what happens when this kind of false, like, algorithmic totality still takes us over and decenters us in it, where we are immersed into it. And I think it's like, how do you deal with that? I think what Hunter was saying was really interesting, and that it's kind of like, what do you do how do you deal with, this information that is so vast that it's like beyond or whatever. So the way I see this is like, I like this idea of, okay, it's decentered. Let's just focus on the center here now, in this kind of absolute now. So I think the problem here is that when people think that everything is already kind of pre-given, that nothing new can be done, because, well, whatever I write down in my whatever essay that I write about whatever, I can then go look after the fact on the Library of Babel website and find it there. But does that mean that nothing new can really be created? No, I don't think so. I think novelty can be created, and that's really the subversive aspect that kind of really throws open the power structures that any kind of an archive operates with. So part of what I read in the secondary source was talking about Derrida's ideas about archives and whatnot, and about how it always has this kind of like structure of power to it. And I was thinking about, okay, how does it operate here? It basically operates through this idea that basically everything is given, so it comes down to just finding it already pre-established, physically located in the library, and then they have these mythologies to kind of support that power structure based off, the vindications, the crimson hexagram, and the man of the book, and this idea of the compendium of all compendiums and all these things. But then it talks about, so on my book, I think it's page 55 or 56. So it talks about a blasphemous sect, where so Hunter kind of seemed to interpret it as like, this is just one more kind of like silly way of trying to make sense of this infinity of senselessness in a sense. But I see this as radically subversive, what they're doing. So the blasphemous sect suggested that searches should cease, and that all men should juggle letters and symbols until they constructed, by improbable gift of chance, these canonical books. The authorities were obliged to issue severe orders. So that's bringing back, okay, so this is obviously an idea about like divination, and also using chance as a creative aspect of bringing these things forward, which goes back to the previous story, I think, about using, these totalities of all these different elements to bring forth something new in creation. So what's going on there is, so in juggling letters and symbols, and then he talks about at the very beginning, this opening line, this quote, "By this art you may contemplate the variation of the 23 letters." So in Kabbalah, the Jewish form of mysticism, they do this with the Torah and whatnot. They will take the letters and basically permute them, give them either number values, and they have a lot of different ways of basically working with this given text to create new meanings out of it. And I think that's what this blasphemous sect is doing in a lot of ways, in order to kind of create novelty instead of basically having people, fly all around in these, vain attempts to try to find these vindications, these ultimate books. It's more like, no, what is this? This book right here contains the absolute, if you know how to create from it. How do we take these elements that we have here and create from that? Because where else are you going to find real creation or vindication or meaning from all these things if you have this, fruitless search to go running through all these hexagrams in search of this mystical crimson hexagram? That's basically never going to actually work as a viable way of living, of finding meaning. You're just constantly going to basically drive yourself crazy or ends up in these turf wars between hexagrams. Instead, I think it's more, you have to see your own hexagram as a crimson hexagram. See your whatever book you're holding as the one that's all powerful and magical or whatnot. So I think that's why I think Borges, he constantly uses these, these heretics and these blasphemous sects to make like these really strong points, I think, about, power and totality and novelty and creation in these things, where maybe it's because I'm a heretic myself or something, but I see these as almost like this is the voice of the divine really speaking to us, this voice that's bringing forth novelty and creation for us against this kind of danger of this looming totality or and whatnot. So I'll just leave it there.
Chase, a couple things is if that paragraph where you were talking about the blasphemous sect. Look at the final sentence of that paragraph. The sect disappeared, but in my childhood, I have seen old men who, for long periods of time, would hide in the latrines with some metal disc and a forbidden dice cup and feebly mimic the divine disorder. So,
Yeah.
I mean, are they? If they're mimicking the divine disorder, he's acknowledging, or he's asserting that yeah, it is chaotic. That there is no plan. There is no. Of course, it's chance. And then also, look at how he ends this story. It's very odd. He ends it with a footnote. How many people end anything with a footnote? But this is a short story, and the first sentence of the footnotes is that has observed that this vast library is useless. And to me, all the points that everybody's been making are extraordinarily thought-provoking. But when I see this, and it's a refrain, right? Kafka and his precursors, he says it explicitly. To me, Borges in this story is talking about the difference between knowledge and wisdom. There can be someone who has an incredible fund of knowledge, but you wouldn't want them going with you to buy a used car. They seem to have all this knowledge, but they don't seem very wise. And it seems to me that, in this story, Borges is talking about all this information and all this knowledge, and very serious people, right? I mean, these are people who are dedicated to trying to learn as much as they can. But by the end of it, how wise are they? What's missing from their pursuit of knowledge? And it's maybe more of a question, but if you all have an answer to that, I'd be interested. But to me, this is, yeah, they're very knowledgeable, but he's questioning their wisdom, or if they have wisdom.
So, go ahead, Joey.
I was thinking that he doesn't, talk about this blasphemous sect being wise at all, which makes me wonder, are they onto something or are they not? Because they seem to kind of be totally giving it up to chance. But would there be some sort of approach where it's they are kind of a sect that supports the ceasing of the searches, but to try and create their own texts, and just kind of have confidence in that, right? Like the whole Nietzschean, like even if you know it's not one of the texts pre-given, it's not the perfect text, like create your own perfect text. To me, yeah, it seems like cultivating that just I guess like that intuition to have your own texts and not just assume them to be phantoms of already pre-written texts that are inadequate compared to the ebook.
Right. I mean, I definitely I have similar feelings to what Joey just said. I didn't when I often like as Chase sort of mentioned, have a lot of like sympathy for heretics, but I think the heretics in the library, I can't say I had a lot of sympathy for them because their particular form of heresy seemed to me to be just as ill-conceived as the library itself and the vindicators and all of the other kind of interpretations of the library that we saw. I was reminded of a few different things while people were talking, and I don't remember who was who in terms of when I got reminded of it. One of the things, so they mention right at the end in that footnote, I think Ed was mentioning this, that you don't really need a whole library to do this. You could just have one infinite book and it would contain all of these things. And a specific thing that I've had told to me, so we it's been like mathematically determined by methods I don't fully understand, right? But pi is definitely an irrational number. And that what that means is that if you try and calculate it, you end up with an infinite, and you can't calculate it, right? Like a finite, but like continuing beyond our capacities to continue to do the series of numbers. And they've proved that those numbers also never repeat, which is why it's an irrational number. So, well, once you know that, what that means is pi is the Library of Babel, right? If you just analyze the entire string of numbers, then you would eventually, right? You can translate other things, you could make the numbers correspond to various letters, or something like that. You could create some sort of process to generate a translation. But it means that technically speaking, in some string of numbers within pi, there is every book you've ever read, every variation of every book that you've ever read, every phone number, every book that will ever be written. And when I think about it that way, it's much less terrifying to me, because it just feels like, well, but that like accessing that is just as difficult as, or more difficult than sort of writing the original thing in the first place. I mean, part of what the library itself seems to do is it makes it a little bit more tantalizing, because it's like, oh, I could put my hands on the physical books, like they're there, right? It's just a matter of finding the right ones. But if I put so in that sense, I actually kind of disagree with the footnote. It's like, well, actually, the library isn't useless. It's like actively disaligning us from the fact that, like, it's actively misleading us. The library is tricking us into thinking there's more there than there actually is. This might as well just be pi or some other irrational number, some random sequence. The other two things that it reminded me of, so we were talking about the difference between knowledge and information, between knowledge and wisdom. And Joey checked out the Roderick series, right? But there, he makes this interesting sort of thing at the beginning of The Self Under Siege, where he sort of mentions that our society is just overwhelmed with information. And Rick Roderick actually divides this up into like three. So there's wisdom, right, which is the thing that we would normally think of as being the thinkers and philosophers. There's knowledge, and there's what he calls information. He's split up in different categories. And he thinks that most of what we have in our world today isn't even knowledge. It doesn't even clear that threshold. It might as well just be random splurts of data. And so much of that series is just on these attempts to make sense of that. And a lot of what making sense of that seems to mean is just like, I think, kind of not engaging with the flow of information, not looking at this infinite library of stuff. And so that ties into my last one, which is the thing that I've been thinking about a lot since almost I started reading this one, is the Feynman lectures. And one interesting thing that he does in there is he's talking about the scientific process of making discoveries. And
Who did you say?
Feynman?
Heidemann?
Okay. Feynman,
Oh, Feynman.
the,
Thank you.
the scientist. Yeah.
Right.
So there are some lectures of his online that you can look up where he's talking about scientific investigation and how that works. And he's a falsificationist. So the way that he presents it, he basically goes, okay, so we never fully affirm a theory. We only disprove a theory. And the way that you need to have some sort of definite theory that makes definite predictions, and then you take those predictions and you can compare them to nature, and then you see if they pan out, right? Do the predictions that we made with this theory match the facts in the world that we see? And then if they don't, then the theory is wrong. And if they do, then you can't say the theory is right, but you can say, well, provisionally it's not wrong, right? And then you just keep checking it as you accumulate more and more data. And so, right, so then as he's laying that out, then he presents this this hypothetical. A student could be like, okay, here's a simple solution to this problem. Then we generate a big wheel, and we spin the wheel, and we hook it up to a computer somehow so that it pulls out a definite. Thank you, Alex. It pulls out a definite. My brain's being dumb. Prediction, right? So it basically randomly generates a guess about reality, and then that computer is hooked up to a data bank with a bunch of known experiments, and so it compares all of those experiments to this new prediction, and then you just have this machine run continuously making guesses about theories. And then he says, so basically, if you held that view, what you would be saying is that guessing is a dumb man's job. Right, it's just something that can be stupid, iterative process. And he says, well, no, it doesn't work anything like that. And kind of the rest of his lectures are sort of dedicated to kind of trying to lay out, like, or I think it's just the rest of that lecture, what it looks like to try and actually make a good guess. Like, how do you actually? It has to be something more than just this random process. And I think that's what's interesting to me, like particularly about Feynman, about Roderick, and about some of the kind of philosophers that try and kind of transcend this attempt to just make sense of random information, in terms of saying that, like, well, actually the process by which you gain any kind of like meaningfulness about the world is not identical with just the random production and checking of ideas, if that makes sense.
Should we talk about fewness? Sorry to be the whatever.
I think it's important because I think, like Chase, I think with all of us, we could probably do this forever.
Yeah, I have an interpretation, but I'm not going to say it. So, yeah, so...
You're as bad as the Inquisitors, burning the books or throwing them over the edge. Jeez, just removing them from us. Who are you to say that your interpretation shouldn't be shared with the rest of us?
Throwing those books into the void.
I didn't even get to talk about my interpretation that really the story is the compendium of all compendiums itself. And it is really, let's move on. Yeah.
Okay, so fewness the Memorious. I don't know. You guys don't need a lead-in question, so go.
So I like this story a lot. You guys have heard me probably mention this story. I read it in the philosophy of literature class with Dr. Benedict, and so what I kind of see this as is, in a way, it's a kind of reductio ad absurdum about nominalism, but I don't think it's necessarily saying that nominalism is wrong. It's just saying that, and I almost like to instead interpret it as okay, what if basically Funes, he's basically kind of tuning into reality in a certain sense, but he's tuning into it too much. And it kind of shows that actually, a full kind of coincidence with reality almost kind of like what Merleau-Ponty was talking about. If you don't have like at least like a partial negativity, or even Bergson, his ideas about perception says basically perception is a selective process of removing certain information so that you can make sense of it. Funes doesn't have that filter anymore. He's just pure coincidence with this absolute of reality in the most, perfect manner possible. And therefore there's no gap, space, or negativity for actual thought. And, also this goes to Nietzsche, where he says basically, error is necessary for thinking. Forgetfulness is actually a value. And I think there's a lot of that in here. And basically it's kind of, I think it's very radical in the sense that it's saying basically, normally we think of, reality as this kind of ultimate goal, this ultimate value in itself, let's get to reality, and this is instead saying like, actually, if you get to reality, you in itself kind of lose reality in another sense, and you can no longer actually interact or be alive. Like there's almost this contradiction between, really living and being in tune with reality, which I guess kind of goes also into our whole idea of, this difference between, say, knowledge or a kind of wisdom, maybe, where I would say, Funes basically, he doesn't really seem to have any kind of wisdom or any kind of like, any way he can have a kind of like practical engagement with anything. In that sense, he's almost like a kind of, dead being. And he constantly, Borges uses the symbolism of a kind of like darkness and almost like Platonic language about, he's inside the cave himself, looking at the shadows on the wall, because he can't separate himself into a kind of forgetfulness and a gap and a negativity away from these things. So, I love this story as I love the other ones, but in particular, I think this one is really extraordinary for me.
Yeah, I instantly thought, I don't know where I saw it. I watched a YouTube video or something, and but there was this person I remember talking about how they had like a really good memory, and that they had like a really hard time being in relationships because the amount of time that it took for them to move on was like way longer than the person they were in a relationship with. It would take actual years to kind of work through, because they had literally every single memory of that relationship, and they couldn't just erase it from their mind. And so I thought that was interesting. But there was also something else that you kind of made me think of when you were talking about Funes, is that I personally have been kind of I was talking last week about how I've been reading books and kind of realizing how much I've changed. But I think another part of my ability to change has been my memory, like being able to forget certain things from my childhood or certain memories from when I was younger that have allowed me to change. I'm not necessarily attached to those memories, and the memories that I am attached to have kind of, shaped me and kept me having like at least some sense of self, so that I'm not just like, lost in the sea of change. But I think that that's been kind of an important part, is me seeing my own forgetfulness is not necessarily a bad thing, as something that's actually helped me be able to grow and not dwell on certain things that I think I would have otherwise. So.
If I can I guess I had to, I've never watched Black Mirror, so maybe but I had this notion the whole time that it's like you're both saying that, like, Ireneo, or Funes, I suppose, is in this position, in this really interesting position that I feel is emblematic of or an example of like a sort of a dialectical process where he is so absolutely in tune with what's happening in front of him that he completely relativizes himself to the point that he says like a number, like 5,700 whatever, is Napoleon, and or is like a side of black beans or some bullshit, and the problem for me, my immediate problem, I was like, how could he ever think about anything? Which I guess he can't, which is the point. But how could he start talking about Napoleon? What he's still trapped in this order of symbols that he has in front of him, and he's not taking in everything and making it all unique. He's just sort of shifting symbols around in front of him. He's just pushing pieces around in this sort of relativistic way. You know what I mean? Where he's just changing the meanings of things and adding to the meanings of things, and which is in a way kind of like a sort of source of novelty in its repetition. He's repeating Napoleon as has meaning both in the Napoleonic sense and in the numerical sense, but it loses the symbolic logic, the order. It just, I think it's just, for me, the conundrum of Funès is a man totally captivated by experience, but totally trapped within symbols. You know what I mean? But I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I wonder if if he has any symbols, because like everything is a particular, and so the reason he can name numbers is because every number is a particular entity. It's not even really a number, it's a particular entity. And so like the entire universe of all things are just particular entities that have, so, which is I think the reason he can't think, I don't know if Borges read this, but in Nietzsche's essay, Truth and Lies in an Extramoral Sense, he's talked specifically about leaves, leaves like leaves on trees, and he says the way we have a concept of a leaf is by looking at these things and forgetting the differences. And so the way you come up with a concept is looking at things that have similarities and forgetting all the differences. So you have to be able to forget in order to be able to have a concept, and you have to have a concept in order to be able to think. And I guess and maybe I'm just being picky here, but I don't even know how the guy could possibly talk, because without, words are symbols, they're concepts. Every word, at least now, are concepts that represent classes of things. And so if for him, every experience is this experience of an infinite number of particulars, I don't know how he could think. I don't know how he could speak. And I also don't know how he could tell the difference between the present and the past. Because if every experience is as intensely available to awareness as my present experience is, it seems like you would have sort of an atemporal, I don't know, there would just be like this growing edge of experience which would continually expand all the time. And maybe that's how you could tell the difference between now and the past was the now is this growing edge of accumulation of experience. But it would just seem like it would be the ever growing accumulation of particular experience. And maybe I'm just being, maybe Borges has to block that stuff simply in order to have a story. But if you take what he's describing here as a kind of experience, it seems like it makes thought, words, and experience itself completely unintelligible.
I think that's an excellent point, Nevitt. I think that's why, think of in a sense, the biography of Funès. This happens to him after he's a certain age from an accident. So he's got the memory of his previous incomplete memory. And so I don't remember his age. So maybe I'm like the narrator of this story. Yeah, it happened in June or July. But that's how I saw Borges squaring the circle of being able to have the man with the perfect memory be able to talk and to be able to talk about things that weren't present physically. I remember a line, and I think it was somebody ridiculing Carlyle, saying something like his memory has swamped his mind. And when I first read this story, I thought of that concept, and it's and what all of you said, if someone is completely absorbed in their memories, there's no way to actually live and to be looking towards the future and acting. A person would be trapped. But another way I was thinking of this is radical empiricism, right? I mean, and I really liked what you said, Nevin, about concept. You know, a concept is actually forgetting the differences of like objects. And it seems to me, though, an empiricist, if they, and I'll defer to you on that and others, but and if empiricism is logically unsustainable because it's making more abstract comments about how we know things, which kind of undercuts the whole idea of what has to have an empirical, factual basis.
Yeah, so I think one thing in the story that kind of hints at that at the notion of, you know, how exactly is he able to function enough in order to say differentiate between the past and the present. I think one thing is, you see he's basically in almost like a sensory deprivation most of the time. He stays, you know, obviously he's paralyzed, and he stays back in you know, his room where it's dark. I think he basically has to do that in order to think about these things. But it kind of does lead to like a paradox in a sense that, okay, if he's having like a perfect memory of the present, or he's perfectly present wherever he is, then how can he dislodge himself from that perfect present in order to then experience a perfect memory of something? It seems like I don't know. You'd almost have to have like an unconscious mind that's then aware perfectly of the present. That seems kind of hard to really think about, and I think, yeah, it is. I think he can't think properly because he only sees those particulars, and even then, to write this story, Borges basically has to tone it down in order to, like, you know, make it a story at all, like to give him, you know, the power of speech in these things, because you could break it down even further than he actually goes to. And it's just that, you know, because he does talk in it, but then he says he criticizes basically language as being, you know, too generic and whatnot, that, you know, the dog at, you know, this time from this perspective is totally different from the dog at, you know, a minute later from a different perspective. Well, you could also see it as the dog just, you know, by just in itself as something in time is itself no longer itself because it's constantly changing. So any kind of duration at all, if you were perfectly present in that and able to see those changes, which a duration is a kind of change, then you would no longer have a perfect correspondence with any present at all. It would be, if you were constantly trying to put some kind of a label or a word on something, it would instantly negate itself at that very moment, in the same way that the present, by, you know, when you call it a present, or even just like this indexical, like now, it constantly self-negates itself as it's spoken, as it's uttered. And I think if you get down to it, really it would be something like that's why you can't really talk about those things in this perfect precision. And language is always a kind of sacrifice that we make in terms of kind of accuracy. It's just, language isn't supposed to communicate reality. It's just supposed to communicate among us about things in these kind of generic notions that we kind of loosely correspond with reality in a way, you know, assuming that most people are using like kind of this common sense correspondence theory of truth. But I think this really kind of breaks that down, but then breaks it down in a way that shows, oh, yeah, but you don't want that other aspect either. So it's almost like you can't really have your cake and eat it too, because either way, if you have your cake, then you can't really eat it, and if you're eating, it's not really your cake. Or, yeah.
Well, I think two things. First off, just I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen Trailer Park Boys. I know that. Okay, so just okay, not important for you to have seen it, but there's just it's just an aside, I guess, before I talk about the actual point, I suppose. But I swear, bear with me. It's Ricky. He's talking about like he's in jail, and he's talking about why he never reads books and why he quit school in 9th grade. And he says, well, you know, if you put too much stuff in your brain, it starts suffocating you, and you can't fit anything else, and you start forgetting people's names and what time it is and where you're at. And so I figured I can't put anything else in my brain, or else it's just going to get too full, you know. So you gotta stop at a certain point to exist. And I think that's kind of Funez is kind of like Ricky from from Trailer Park Boys. He's just like, I refuse to. You know, or at least he's Ricky. If Ricky tried to learn everything, he just gets kind of swallowed up by it all. But my point here, on page 64, 2 pages before the end, there's a middle paragraph on page 64 in my edition. It starts with these things he told me. Neither then nor later have I ever placed them in doubt. In those days, there were no cinemas or phonographs. Nevertheless, it is odd and even incredible that no one ever performed an experiment with Funez. And then that last sentence of that paragraph. The truth is that we live out our lives putting off all that can be put off. Perhaps we all know deep down that we are immortal and that sooner or later all men will do and know all things. You know, I think that's, at least the way I read that, the way I took that, was it's kind of like an explanation to how Funez can claim to be this. Like maybe it's kind of like, oh yeah, Funez is claiming that he's totally wrapped up in the moment and that he's got this perfect memory, or it seems as though he's got this perfect memory and he can't think or talk, and yet he continues to speak. There's this. It's like you're saying. It's like as if there's this eternal present consciousness, or this notion, or this mindfulness of the present. That there's this portion of things, like we said, the inhuman core, the thing beyond the appearance, this thing we put off constantly, right? Which it's not that like, you know, we're all yeah, book dummies. It's not that we're all just a bunch of confused book dummies. It's that Funez is working on a radical project, or I guess he's kind of because of his accident, he's kind of forced into a radical project that is putting things off. Just as we are putting things off, but in kind of the opposite direction. You know, we ignore differences in things to create categories, and we use that in order to succeed and to have a sense of self and centralization and identity of things. You know, but Funez is kind of the inverse. He puts off or ignores the similarity or the repetition of things. You know, he puts off this part of the project because of this sort of certainty, this as if he knows deep down that he will see everything, you know, it can be done at least, or that man will do and see all things, you know, that there's no need for something like a category. Even it can be conceived, or, you know, maybe Funez really physically, I guess, like, because it's like a psychological case, like in phenomenological perception, they're talking about Reinhardt or whatever the guy's name, Schneider, that is his name. Yeah, so, but like, you know, he's I guess he's had sort of an accident, so maybe he's forced into this position, but perhaps, you know, it's more participatory than just, yeah, for Schneider. Maybe it's more participatory in this story than just a person who is a victim of some psychological thing. It's a participatory thing. You know, I think. I don't know.
Something I thought that was kind of interesting that doesn't, I don't know how it ties into the story, but the fact that he's smoking, the fact that he has the morbidity of being paralyzed, but that it also, Borges like intentionally notes at the end that he died of congestion of the lungs, which is as a result of an inability to participate in regular physical activities, but it's also caused by smoking. So I'm curious if that has any kind of like metaphorical or literal meaning when it comes to like his access to try to, I guess, come to terms with his situation.
Makes me think of Aristotle when he's talking about there's these different kinds of life. There's the life of pleasure, there's the life of public service, and there's the life of contemplation, which is of course the best because that's what philosophers do. And you get this picture of these philosophers just sitting around contemplating all the time, and just thinking, like the prime mover. But then if you just sit there and do that, you're going to get congestive or whatever he died of, because you're just not going to move. You're just going to be sitting there, a pure observer, purely observing and doing nothing but observing. And when Ed asked whether he's a radical phenomenologist, I don't remember the details of this, but I remember when Husserl is talking about his method, there's a problem that arises in that, some of us have been chatting about it, but there's this problem that arises between the experience and the observation of the experience. And that, what Husserl seems to want to do is have a direct encounter with the things themselves, or, with phenomena, and have this immediate, not mediated, this unmediated encounter with experience. But the problem is, anytime you talk about that, that is no longer unmediated. It's mediated through thought and language. And so it's there's this difficulty for Husserl in how do you bridge that gap? How do you translate the immediacy of experience into a mediated form through words? And it seems like Funes is kind of in that situation. He's got this constant, immediate experience of perception, but that seems to make the possibility of reflecting on it, that makes that impossible.
Well, remember the one language in Toulon where it didn't have any nouns. And I was thinking, and maybe it's just because of the what's going on in our country now, last couple of weeks. But obviously, to be kept an obvious, conceptualization, abstraction is extraordinarily important and has given us a great deal of knowledge and maybe a certain amount of wisdom, that we can abstract, that we can ignore minor differences, and we can put things in categories. But at the same time, look at the problems that it happens if you have if you close your mind prematurely. You don't have enough information, but you think you do, so then you categorize something. And what is racism other than categorization and lumping a whole bunch of different kinds of people into one category and saying these people have certain characteristics that the person putting them in that category doesn't like? And so I think that sometimes it is important to say to people, be very, very careful of your conceptualizations, because they have real world consequences for people who never did anything wrong. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good point in the sense that, see, when I first read this story, I kind of liked Funes in the sense that it's like, oh, he's actually getting in touch with some kind of an essence of radical difference that's really at kind of the core of things, that language kind of superimposes, these categories over, and they're necessary and convenient in a certain degree. They also lead to a lot of dangers of illusions, in that people get kind of swept up in this totalizing system of these categories and really Funa shows that, well, those categories are kind of, somewhat arbitrary in a sense. So I think kind of the solution to this would be, since, as we've established in Borges, I think established in the story, that Funes is not really in a good position, but then the danger of having like a totalizing system of categorical language, I think, is another one of those kind of totalities that Borges also is kind of warning us about it, and through all these stories. And I think really the solution to something like that would be, you almost kind of need so we have to use categories and language to some degree in order to communicate at all. But it's kind of like we need these injections of difference and novelty to kind of give us this rupture of our categories every once in a while, to kind of break us out of these strict molds that we mistakenly think is some inherent part of the ontology of nature or something like that. And I think that's where we need to see instead that these things are processes that we're kind of creating, and that there's always a kind of problem to them. And I think we need to be skeptical of language in these categories by being aware that, like, really they're kind of, these sort of accretions on top of this bed of radical process and difference. And maybe this, my delusion tendencies obviously coming out, but I think that's where we can kind of see how this would work in terms of this, meaning the kind of radical difference and particularity that Funes perceives as kind of injections within life to break up categories so they aren't stale, so that we have some kind of novelty of thought. So that's basically Deleuze's idea, is that, through sensations, you have a kind of violence against your thinking categories that then make you think new ideas, radical new ideas. And that's kind of his idea of like this new image of thought, is the image of thought that has to deal with the violence of sensation that doesn't conform to our ready-made categories. So I think that's very important. And yeah, I think, it's so obviously, I think it deals with all kinds, this has been somewhat of a kind of theme, I think, throughout this seminar, is basically, these problems with like different categories of thinking or totalizing systems and things like that. And I think it plays out so well with, historical problems of, social problems from like people that, against like religion, race, gender, whatever it is, all these different things, your economic status, all these different categories that we can think of that put people against one another, by kind of really radically challenging this kind of binary division of us versus them. I think that's one of the best things about theory that we can actually contribute to today, and that the world needs this kind of stuff today. I was going to say now more than ever, but then that would sound like a coronavirus commercial, or every commercial. But basically, I think that's what we can contribute, as theorists or philosophers or whatever you want to call us, a kind of, injection of this novelty, but with a subtle awareness that we still need these categories. We still have to think in these terms, and they still have a reality in the sense that people operate on these terms. People operate like these categories are absolutely real. So I think, yeah, it's complex, but I think that's one thing we can kind of learn from this story.
I think that, like gender, it seems to me to be a particularly good case where, I've not really engaged in gender studies, so I'm going to say stuff that's probably completely wrong, but that it seems to me that gender, it's either a continuum or it's there's a whole lot of different possibilities, like an indefinite number of gender possibilities. And, but that's difficult for us to live with and conceptualize. And so, you know, it's kind of like gender is kind of the reality of gender is something like Funèse's perception, you know, it's just like all this stuff. But that's difficult not only to think about, it's difficult to live with, it's difficult to figure out what kind of clothes to wear, it's difficult to figure out what kind of roles to perform. And so maybe, you know, like part of the warning, so what, this is kind of my takeaway from what you're saying in a particular example, is a warning can be, don't assume that your categories are reality, or don't assume that they have real ontological, you know, force behind them. And so try to always remember that, okay, maybe I can't get away from thinking in terms of, for example, gender categories. And maybe it's true that, you know, that we all wear clothes, and then we naturally put certain kinds of clothes into certain kind of gender categories, but try to always bear in mind, in the background of my mind, that that's not the way it is. And that it's really just, like I said, a continuum or some kind of really, I don't want to say fracture, but you know what I mean? It's like a lot of possibilities there. And, you know, so then I think of myself as a male and as having this masculine gender, but, you know, who knows, there's all kind of weird shit going on inside of my mind, and, you know, sexual tendencies and stuff. And I think that's probably true for everyone. So I think that's a good, important takeaway.
One thing that I would say with that specifically, the metaphor I always liked is this one. I think this was again Rick Roderick, but he's talking about Derrida, and he talks about this idea of not foreclosing our definitions. So if you think about like a rigid, almost sort of like grammar Nazi type who says, okay, this word has this discrete definition and that's what it means, and that's sort of the end of the conversation, right? And the thing is that you could hold a system like that, and still be, for instance, like technically okay with, you would probably want to do something like say, well, there's, you know, men, women, and other. And so those are the three categories, and then that's the end of the conversation, and everything gets fit into those three categories. But I think what Derrida suggests as an kind of alternative, but I like the sound of societal Nevitt. It just sounds good. But there's
Is that really not a word? Societal?
That feels like a word.
I thought that was a word.
I think it's an ugly word. Societal.
Gonna moralize the words, right?
4 syllables. Social. 2 syllables. I'm sorry. I was offended by your dissing of grammar Nazis. So.
No, it's just that you had an aesthetic complaint.
An aesthetic complaint.
It's like, wow.
I apologize, Sean. I totally derailed you.
Actually, I like that. I mean, I think that like bringing in aesthetics here is actually very useful, because I mean, the way that I approach words in this specific example that I kind of just say words, and if they sound like they work well in the sentence that I said them in, then I'm like, that's a word. And if you need me to unpack what I mean by it, then I can do that. And that seems to allow the generation of like lots of new words that don't fit in with like a traditional sort of like dictionary grammar Nazi type explanation of things. At the same time, right, like I mean, you need to know what I mean, right? And if we're bringing this back to the question of gender, it's like, okay, well, if I call this masculine or I call this feminine, those words aren't helpful if they can mean anything, right? And so part of what I think is helpful here is not necessarily just thinking about this as it being like the world is more anarchic than the words that I used to describe it, but specifically approaching words and being like, I'm constantly willing to revitalize, revise, rethink what a particular word means with respect to a particular context and with respect to the specific aesthetic that I'm interested in at that moment. I actually think aesthetics is a really good way to approach this.
Um, and actually, I wish I could remember it more specifically. Maybe some of you stumbled over it. A few years ago, this would have been in Europe because obviously a lot of European languages have masculine and feminine. English doesn't for its nouns. A group of people actually did a kind of survey research study to ask people, and I don't remember if it was in France or Germany. I don't think it was in Southern Europe. And what they found out is that when they started to ask people to give adjectives to describe different nouns, that what was striking to them was that the adjectives clustered one way for the feminine nouns and clustered another way for the masculine nouns. And they weren't necessarily expecting that. They thought maybe they would be a wash, but it was really striking to them. And so I do think that to a certain extent, well, look at in politics. What are people on the political spectrum called if they want reform and change? They are on what side? That wasn't a rhetorical question. I was hoping you'd answer.
The left?
The left. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I
Now,
indicated on my left, but then
well,
I guess this is on the
it
this
looks
is on
like
the
you're
right. I
because
guess at the
it's in a
screen.
mirror.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always those right wingers who are trying to reform
No,
everything.
but think of the word right,
Yeah.
and it's not only just in English. Right, correct, right. Look at all the positive associations in English and probably in French. I defer to you who can read French of the word right. Right. How do you pronounce adroit? Adroit.
Yeah.
You know,
Adroit.
Yeah, adroit. Of the right. Now,
In Latin,
Go ahead.
left means sinister. Sinister, basically. That's where we get our word sinister. It's from the word for left.
I'm left-handed, and my wife reminds me of that occasionally.
And you're lucky it wasn't beat out of you in grade school.
They tried.
Okay.
Yeah, my dad said he went through that.
My
I
father
had
too.
I think it was either my first grade or my second grade teacher tried to force me to write right-handed. Fortunately, my mother was an educator, and I must have told her, and she walked into the classroom and said, "He's left-handed, damn it." I mean, she didn't say damn it because she was a good bat.
Gosh darn it.
He's left-handed. But yeah, so there's these weird, our concepts carry these weird associations that have these negative connotations to them.
I mean, what if at the French National Assembly at the very beginning of the French Revolution, the people who wanted more change were to the right of the presiding officer, not the left? I mean, I just it's amazing to me spooling that out into the future.
I mean, that's what's happening in the mirror world, right?
Yes. Oh yeah, that's the funny thing. They were actually sitting on the right side, but it was to the left of the presiding officer.
So this is kind of unrelated, but maybe it's a good final remark. I've just been thinking about it the past 15 minutes. But one of the things I really liked about the story was that the reason why the narrator was originally interested in him was because of his concept of time. Like he could just instantly tell the time. And it wasn't clear whether or not he still had that ability, after his accident. Like it never really, that he never asked him about that or asked him about the time. But I thought that was kind of subversive, but also maybe, your concept of time would probably change if you had that kind of memory. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of, metric clock time, that's kind of the ultimate, like human convention of trying to, there's so many people, how many people think of time as just like, oh, that's like a year, I remember talking to my roommate once, I don't know, mentioned something about time, I guess. And I was basically like, what is time in some sense was the question. And then for like 5 minutes, he explained basically like how metric time is calculated in terms of like a year in the revolution of the planet and the sun and all that stuff. And we were just like, okay, that's how you measure time. But like, what is time? You have not answered anything really. And I think that's a good example of, there's like the language aspect of these conventions of trying to just like put these homogeneous, metric elements on things. And then there's the durational difference of things that we can't talk about. We can only kind of, like Merleau-Ponty said, kind of, almost have like a fleshy like covering of, or kind of, almost thinking of like these very kind of like almost like sensual metaphors of like how language tries to grasp something but can't. It's like smoke in the air, but ultimately you just get congestive lung failure or whatever. So that's the moral of the story, kids.
Don't smoke.
Yeah, or if you're gonna smoke, then you're just gonna end up like Funes. Yeah, just gonna sit there in your bed all day.
Though, but look at his name. Is that, did you know Latin? Is that anything?
So I'm not sure about Funes, but then it's like, yeah, Funes the Memorious. Obviously, that's just based off memory, and then that's gonna come down to the Greek for basically memory. In Greek was also the Muses as well. Or memory was I think a daughter of the Muses, or maybe it's the reverse, but that's a possible connection you can make in terms of kind of putting these associations together, because I think the Muses and creativity in a sense, and memory, those are important distinctions. But I think for Funes, basically his memory has killed the Muses in a sense. Is I don't see him creating much other than his nonsensical faux language.
Well, yeah, but I mean, did you ever read the novel "The Flowers for Algernon"?
No, I've heard of it though.
It's a retarded man who doctors perform surgery on him, and not only, begging your pardon, I'm 62, so retarded was not a negative term. It was the preferred term. He has a surgery, and not only is he not retarded, he is going into the genius territory. And it talks about, literally, I do not know how Keyes was able to do this, but he's actually able to present his kind of like thought processes as he's becoming more and more intelligent. And it seems to me that, is dog actually the best we can do? Okay, a Chihuahua and a Siberian Husky. I mean, we should. Why is dog acceptable to us, right? And to me, if I'm going to argue from Funes, right, he is seeing, for lack of a better term, reality, the empirical world, with much greater clarity than we are. And what is wrong with getting a richer vocabulary? Is it because simply for most of us, dog covers it? We know a dog, and that for our world that works. But part of that is because of we don't care that much about dogs. Possibly, right? Look at look at language in different areas of science, and just different areas of how what's the word I want to use? How rich and dense vocabulary is in different areas of study. You, Chase and Nevica, you can rattle off any number of philosophical terms, which I think for a lot of people, they would say, I have no idea what you just said. And are you going to say, well, I'm going to translate this into more normal everyday English? Or are you going to say, I'm sorry, but to really know what this means is you're going to have to belly up to the bar, and you're going to have to spend time to understand these terms on their own because of their importance in this philosophical school of thought?
Yeah, well, Heidegger would definitely say the latter. That's why he basically created his own language, and to try to get us out of, thinking in terms of these old concepts. Basically, I think he thought that, you have to do something different with language itself in order to think differently. And I think that's why there is a lot of, sort of neologisms in philosophy along with the concept creation. I think part of it is also kind of job security. Because, I was trying to fix my car yesterday because my goddamn battery died. And I realized everything in a car is purposefully put in this mystified manner so that you need specialists to do it. And I'm thinking like, okay, that's probably not too different from philosophy in the sense that we do kind of, put things in these specialized terms in order for job security. Because what are we in a sense other than basically being able to, I can pick up like a book of Heidegger and actually kind of tell you what it means and kind of do that translation where other people would just have no idea what that is. And the same, you could see this with any number of, specialized occupation in that, someone that does coding or something like that, I look at code and it looks like, the Library of Babel. It looks, nonsensical to me, where they would see, almost kind of like a perfect order in that. So, yeah.
But isn't this, but our hope would be that language is the basis of communication, right? And to bridging differences that we might have to be able to understand each other more, even if we are from different backgrounds, genders, whatever the concepts that I was questioning before, right? But look at how language has been perverted and this is perfectly true in the financial world. They will come up with terms for different financial products that are amazing in the amount of adjectives they have for that product. If you ever want to read a disturbing book, read The Big Short by Michael Lewis. And when I wrote down the term for one of these types of financial paper, my students started to laugh out loud. And all I was doing was writing down the term that the financial markets use for this financial paper. And so for me, language is supposed to be designed to further communication, not to create citadels of the elite that they can just communicate with themselves. And even at the level of a mechanic, right? What is happening to us? What is happening with the development of language?
Yeah, I agree. And so basically, I think it's almost like there's these institutional pressures that make it where that kind of specialization and mystification is somewhat occurring. But then, but then also it kind of does make sense within its own logic why it's happening. So it's kind of, yeah, it's a tricky situation because ultimately I think, language should be, in a sense, used at least to a certain degree for communication. But then also there is a kind of, I think there's another way of using language as a kind of expressive manner that is expressing a kind of ambiguity to things. It's almost like, I think of, say, like film or something like that, or any kind of number of art. I think you don't want to show something in so complete of manner, like a Funes way of like perfect coincidence. And I think language in almost like a poetic sense has to also have that kind of gap there. And so I think it's a kind of a multifaceted problem in a sense.
I only had one German reading course, which is why I can't really read German, but the woman who taught it said that, I don't know, that for a long part of German intellectual history, there was sort of a German intellectual machismo that had to do with building complicated sentences and complicated paragraphs. And because German is partially inflected, you could build these nested structures of verbs and adjectives or subjects and objects and so on. And that you see that reflected in Kant and a lot of writers. And then my dissertation advisor said, so then the French writers, Sartre and so on, they learned to write from reading the German writers who wrote in these complicated fashions. And so it's fairly unusual to see someone like Schopenhauer's writing is actually fairly clear, but that's kind of the unusual thing. So, so it's just sort of an intentional obscurification, because it kind of shows, what kind of verbal structures I can create. And then you've got the poor English translators trying to figure out how to unpack that stuff and make it sound reasonable in English. And this, it's just a, terrible, like reading Kant, it's just so hard because of that kind of stuff. And it's unnecessary, probably.
Yeah, French used to be known for its clarity, because I think for that very reason that it doesn't necessarily have that that aspect of German where you can just stack everything together, which is actually kind of like one of the languages in Toulon, I think, where you just like stack adjectives together. And so I'm pretty sure, I know I've mentioned this in one of these seminars, but so I took a class on Buddhism, and they talk about how Sanskrit, the kind of the sacred language of India, is like German, and that you can stack all these syllables, these prefixes and suffixes all together to create these really complex concepts. And when Buddhism was spreading, trying to, further itself in other parts of the country or the world or whatnot, they went to China, and these Sanskrit concepts could not be translated into Chinese, because Chinese is a very different language, where they just simply didn't have it was not in Chinese to be able to take on that kind of structure of language and concepts. And because of that, they had to basically form a completely different type of Buddhism. They could not do that kind of very intellectual, philosophical form of Buddhism that came from India. And that's where you get Chan Buddhism, which became Zen from, is because they went to China and basically like, we have to do something different. And so it became, a syncretic religion with Taoism and whatnot, because that's much more to the sensibility of the Chinese, with not only with I think their culture, but also with their language structure, because that just didn't work. But it's interesting to see how those interactions actually form, new expressions of those languages when they interact with each other. Like I think French and English, now we've kind of just taken that German structure in a lot of places where sometimes I'll write stuff out. I'm trying to think of something. I won't know how to put it into different English words. I'll just, put some dashes and just make it a 4-word word. And there you go. Thanks, Heidegger.
So are we done?
I think so.
Thank you all very much. I always learn so much from everybody.
Yeah, me too.
All right. See y'all later.
See you guys later.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.